Hello, everyone. It's great to be back discussing the new book by David Amerland. And of course, as always, it's immense pleasure to have David himself participate. Hello, David.
Oleg, hi, how are you?
Doing well, thank you. How are you?
Good, yeah, not bad. All things considered.
Sounds good. All things considered, for those that don't know, I mean, David is not getting much sleep and he's doing a tremendous amount of work. So that's the all things considered part. All right, so we're going to talk about the Sniper Mind some more today. For those that don't know, that may have not seen our first hangout on this topic, I'm going to bring a little screen up real quick and just we'll go through the preliminary stuff here. So as you can see, the book is called The Sniper Mind. It's available on Amazon and with a bunch of other David's books. The book, unfortunately, bad news, the book is not yet available to actually own, but you can pre-order it, which means you'll own it as soon as it comes out. And if you pre-order it now, as you can see right now, this particular page is for the Kindle version, the ebook version, and that's only $14.99, which is 46% off the retail. So you can save almost half by pre-ordering the book now. That's the great news. And then the other great news is if you go to the hardcover page, you can see that hardcover page is 34% off if you pre-order now. So significant savings for anybody who wants to buy this book. And as you can see, I purchased the book on April 4th. So I'm going to be waiting a few more months, but it's getting there. And you can buy either version, both versions, however you want to do it. You pre-order, and then they will ship it as soon as it's available. So The Sniper Mind on Amazon.com. If you do a search for The Sniper Mind, you'll get that. Also, you can go to, no, don't go to this place. Go to the snipermind.com website, which is David's website specifically dedicated to this book. And so you can have, there's a series of articles that David has published on there, and excellent articles, by the way. And he keeps adding articles all the time. So while you're waiting for the book to come out, you can get some really interesting, useful information by going to the Sniper Mind website. thesnipermind.com is the URL to get there. And of course, last but not least, you can always go to davidamerland.com, which is David's main site for all his endeavors and all his books. And there it is, it's right there. Hello, my name is David Amerland. So you know you're at the right place when you see this little headline. So with that, let's go back to our discussion with David, who wrote this exceptional book. I've had the pleasure of reading this book for a little bit. I'm still not totally down with it, but we have plenty to talk about. So let me bring up my notes here and we'll talk about it. So David, we'll just kind of jump right in where we left off.
Okay.
The thing that I want to talk about is you're talking about the importance of vision, and you're talking about the ability of the brain to adjust something that's called neuroplasticity, which is something I've never heard before. Maybe you can talk about a little bit about that, because one of the things they found very interesting and also not only intriguing but also satisfying is that obviously me, just like everybody else who's getting old or older anyway, is kind of the vision gets worse, different things get worse with time. Yes. But according to your book there, it says that neuroplasticity is something that the brain has ability, using neuroplasticity, to adjust at any age. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's unpack this a little bit for those who haven't yet sort of come across the subject, and also to prepare the ground for the book itself. Now, essentially, a lot of the information processing that goes on in our brain is visual, and there's a large part of the brain which is devoted to analyzing, cataloging, processing, and sort of going through that information which our eyes feed it in order to understand what's happening around us. Despite that massive amount of processing and connectivity that goes on through our eyes with the world, the brain itself takes huge amounts of shortcuts. That's the easiest way to explain it, by pre-populating data fields. So when we look out in the world, especially when we're in familiar environments, the brain has already pre-populated the information And it does something which anybody who has upgraded a file on the cloud is familiar with. You get a chance to basically replace a folder from scratch, or simply have the software check 2 folders and simply replace the items which are new. Now, if you do the second one, it's a lot faster because you haven't replaced the entire folder. Essentially, the brain does that. So it looks at the environment around us, it picks out to see what kind of information is new, it populates that, and it pre-populates all the other things. It's not as flawless as it sounds, because essentially we can be fooled. And we know about visual illusions. We know about magicians who are able to basically guide our eyes in a certain way and program our expectations so that we see what we expect to see. And that is the basic flaw that exists in the brain. Now, what happens every time we essentially go through this process is the brain itself forges connections. Depending how we look at the world, those connections can be activated, or it can be strengthened, or it can be lessened. And let me explain all of that. Essentially, suppose you do the same things every day, absolutely same things. You come out of your house, you say hi to your friend, to your neighbor because he comes out at the same time. You get into your car, you drive to work. And if you do that, almost everyone has experienced a day when you go to work and you can't remember how you did it. You can't remember the drive to work. You think, I can't remember a thing about it because you were so busy thinking about something. Now, obviously, the part of your brain which was busy thinking about things was new and fresh and was where you're concentrating. The rest of your brain was actually working things through, and it was taking it through that routine which you experienced every day, and it did it pretty flawlessly because you got to work and there was no accident. The reason you was able to do that is because there are neural pathways in the brain which are essentially model creation mechanisms which allow us to create a 3D representation of the world around us and navigate it safely. Now, suppose in that instance, as you are driving to work, you're thinking about something, you're not really aware of your surroundings, and an 18-wheeler sort of comes across your vision. At that time, at that point in time, your brain would actually kick in. New mechanisms would come in, new visual information would be processed, and you'd snap to the present. The question, of course, here is, would you have sufficient time to react and save yourself from having a crash? Well, that depends on so many other variables. But this is what would actually happen. There is a way of looking at the world which is intentional. Suppose you actually train yourself every time to come out of the house, instead of sort of blindly saying to your neighbor, "Morning, Roger," whatever his name is, getting into your car and driving to work, you actually get out, look at the world around you, catalog every item like you always do, check to see what's different, check to see temperature, have a little database in your head where you basically infer things from what you see, get into your car and pay attention to the drive. As you're driving, you're looking at your rear view mirror, you're looking at your side mirrors, you're looking at what's in front of you. You're basically in the moment. If you're doing that, the way that you actually process information is entirely different. It's exactly the same visual information. And what happens then is that the brain constantly creates pathways which enrich the visual data field that it actually receives. All this is very labor intensive. As individuals, evolutionary, we have one superpower and one superpower only. Most people will say it's the brain. No, it is not the brain. We have a brain like almost any other living being on the planet. Maybe it's different, maybe it's more complex, but it is a brain nevertheless. It's essentially a grouping of neural pathways and ganglia that interconnect and exchange information with each other. So that is not our superpower. The superpower which we have, which makes us unique, is our ability to optimize the way that we do things and to look constantly for ways to optimize our actions and processes. Now, that is also partially in common with every other living being on the planet. If you have a cheetah, the cheetah is hardwired to essentially optimize the way it runs across the savannah, so it becomes the fastest sort of cat in the world. But the cheetah, by its form, is locked into one particular field of optimization. If you take a cheetah out of the savannah and you bring it into your backyard and you live in downtown Seattle, well, essentially, it will not be able to adapt sufficiently to survive. So it has a problem. But we're not like that. We look at patterns, we look at overlapping information, we look at how things click together, and we constantly look for ways to optimize. So we're essentially an optimization machine that's always on, and that is our superpower. What does that mean essentially is that our brains constantly rewire themselves. This is where neuroplasticity comes in. And when it comes to vision, if we are careful in the way we operate, we can essentially almost reverse a little bit of the aging process. Now you're going to say, well, how is that possible? I'll tell you how it's possible. Essentially, our eyes, although our vision changes with age, our eyes don't change, they're the same. So what changes partially is a processing mechanism. There's a little bit more to that in terms of the slight focus that happens and the amount of light that is available. But the amount of processing that goes on is important. So vision doesn't really take place in the eye, it takes place in the brain. And famously, as I was doing my research, there was an experiment that they did with this one. And they took volunteers and they put them in a simulator, and they told them, guys, we're going to test your vision up. We're going to see how you fare in terms of being fighter pilots. And we'll see how sharp your eyesight is. And as you'd expect from that experiment, people fared relatively poorly because they were not fighter pilots. Then they took another group of people and they said, guys, you're going to be fighter pilots for the day. Same experiment. They dressed them up in a fighter pilot uniform, and they gave them the spiel about, here you go to safeguard your country, etc. They put them in the game, and that's it. They were in that environment. Now, all that's different in these two situations is that the first group were told, we're testing your eyesight, and the second group were told, yeah, fighter pilots, and you're going to basically be kings of the sky. They were immersed into that. The brain of the second group activated more centers than the brain of the first group. As a result, they all showed improved eyesight, even though the age groups were the same, the average eyesight was the same, and so on. So essentially, they were able to improve their eyesight simply because they were game playing and they were immersed in their role, and they operated like fighter pilots. And this shows, if anything, the ability of the brain, once it's optimized, to help us do almost anything better, even see, which we think, well, that is not possible. Actually, it is possible. We see more, we process more, we understand more, simply by this amount of intentional focus. And that is where that neuroplasticity comes in. The brain changes itself, rewires, does things differently, and actually achieves greater levels of performance.
Makes a lot of sense. For those who are wondering about the age reversal, yes, David is actually 125 years old, but using techniques in the book, you can see he's much, much younger than that. But this intense focus is definitely, if you look at a lot of books, and a lot of people telling you that, if you put, it's almost like you can manifest some things by putting the proper focus on them. So if you look at all these different things, including what David has written and what he just talked about, then it becomes very clear that putting an intense focus on something makes a huge difference. And this is how a lot of these snipers get into what we talked about last time, with the state of flow, as they call it. Is this intense focus is what helps them or makes them be able to do that. And so getting back to the business aspect of it, I'm going to read a little excerpt from the book where David wrote, businesses, and pay attention here because it's kind of, you really need to focus on this to process it. And before I read this, though, I want to say one more thing, is that when we do the driving, like David described, a lot of times you just get in the car, you drive, you get wherever you want to go, and like you said, you don't really pay much attention to anything that's going on unless something drastic happens where a little dog runs in front of you or something like that. You immediately, snap into it. And so that right there is kind of no different than us breathing. We don't think about breathing, but yet, obviously it's controlled by the brain and we do breathe. And so it's kind of, we have these mechanical or automated, I should say, mechanisms in place that take care of various functions inside the body, including breathing is the easiest way to look at it. But then if you look at it from the driving experience, you can see that it's a combination of things of how we are able to focus on one thing while doing something else, just like driving and talking, for example. It's a perfect example where we're doing two things. We're not focusing on one particular thing. And so I think that's why most people, in my opinion anyway, have a challenge with being able to really intently focus on something because of this kind of scatterbrain approach to everything else we're doing. Because we have to get this done, we have to get this done, and you know, it's on and on and on. And I think we kind of get used to it. So on one hand, the brain is optimizing and trying to be not cheetah-like, because cheetahs, like David's, there was an article David posted on Google Plus today talking about this very thing, about how cheetahs are these amazing animals, and at the same time they don't have the same capability, and they have a real tough time surviving because they don't have the optimization capability of the brain that humans do. Right, David?
Absolutely, yes. It was exactly.
That was in your article, so hopefully you agree with me.
Yes, I was, yes.
And so anyway, yeah, we don't put Africans in downtown Seattle to try it, but we do have a lot of Indians. So, and they seem to adapt just fine, no problem.
Exactly, yeah.
So anyway, so back to this point here is the business related. It says businesses that are focused and driven with a clear sense of purpose and a defined idea of their place in the world are truly unstoppable. Their every action has a far greater effect than masses of wasteful marketing activity from their competitors. And so this right there, when you look at the whole focus approach in life, and you transfer it to business and what you do in business, I think that paragraph there pretty much states exactly that what's lacking in a lot of businesses that can't seem to succeed is that this lack of both focus and purpose. That's like almost like a laser focus to get where they need to go. And I'll let David elaborate on this particular paragraph right there.
That's a great example you brought up. Thank you for doing that. Now, essentially, that does reflect the frequency that in business we adopt the same approach to almost automatic driving, where we do the same things every day. We don't really think about them. We don't do anything intentional. We don't do anything in a way that is self-aware. And let's examine this a little bit. And I'm also going to preface sort of preface this a little bit by saying that when we focus intentionally, we sort of want things to happen. There's a very fine line between the delusional, and the wishful thinking, where you say, I want it to rain today. It doesn't matter how much you focus on that. It doesn't matter how many times you say it to yourself. Well, it's not going to rain today if you haven't got any clouds in the sky. Okay, that's simply impossible. So in order to achieve these relatively impossible outcomes and make them happen, when we are intentional, that's based on it's built on a variety of steps and a variety of building blocks that are actually self-affirming in the reality that they build up. So for instance, when it comes to doing something which most people would consider impossible, the road that gets you there is built up of little steps which allow you to create bigger steps, and they're practical in their essence. You're doing things which build up your skill set, they build up the confidence in yourself, they build up your affinity for certain things, they build up your identity in terms of the capability and the sense of purpose and mission that you create for yourself. And all those things together then go on to create the bigger thing which says, oh, wow, that's amazing. Now, when we transfer this into the business environment, it's the attention to detail. Yes, we've set up a shop and we're selling books. We set up a bookshop. The easiest thing in the world, right? People read, we have books. What more would you want? And then the question is, well, if you're doing this and you're, fighting against giants like Amazon and Barnes and Noble and established bookshops, in order to succeed, you really need to pay attention to every tiny little detail. In order to do that, you need to understand the importance of those details. In order to do that, you need to understand the importance of those details in relation to your audience. And if you're doing this, it means you're actually empathetic towards your audience, you understand what they want, and you're fulfilling a need that goes beyond their need to buy a book. So right. If you do that in your business, it becomes a very intentional pathway that links the identity of who you are, which explains why you're doing the things that you do in a certain way, to the audience expectation. And then you're forging a relationship. And all this complexity starts from the little details in you setting things up.
Yeah, and I think if you look at, for example, of like the Google boys, somebody I like to bring up a lot, you can see that they obviously did not intend to focus and concentrate on building this massive business. That wasn't their intent at all. And I think that's the key point to understand is you're not going out there with focusing on the purpose of building something huge, which will make you zillionaire and everything else. Most people who do that fail within like 2 years of even trying that. And I think the reason is the difference is you're not really focusing on the business per se. What you're focusing on, well, what you want to focus on is whatever it is that you're trying to get done and accomplish. And in reference, like you just pointed out, David, to people you're doing it for. So the Google boys decided that they wanted to create this search engine because there was a lack of what was available at the time, and that was their mission. They didn't even want to start a business initially. I mean, the whole business started by sheer accident because somebody heard about what they're doing, decided to give them 100 grand, and they didn't even have a business account to put it into, so they had to actually start a business, open a business account so they can put this $100,000 check in. That was the actual story of what happened originally with Google. There was no Google. Both Larry and Sergey, all they wanted to do was to build this, and they did build this initial search engine that they thought would work better by using the approach that they came up with. So the concentration wasn't on the business at all. The concentration was on this particular it's not even a product, it's just the idea that they had that they tried to accomplish. And I think that could be true. And I think you could say the same thing about Bezos. You know, the guy did not set out to build this huge business. I mean, the guy I think they went out of business almost 3 times, you know, trying to do the business thing. But the key thing was that he had this idea and this vision, and he knew that what he wanted to do, and he had a certain way of how he wanted to approach it. And based on the fact that they did almost go out of business several times, a lot of businesses do actually go out of business trying it. It's not like it's a guaranteed formula for success. But if you don't have that intense focus and purpose, I think, and the self-identity and understanding of your customers or people who should be your customers, you have no prayer or no hope of accomplishing anything, I think.
Okay, brilliant examples and very astute sort of approach to what you said now. And let's actually look at it a little bit, because the moment that we mention this, the immediate reaction is that if you're not a massive global giant like Google, for instance, or Amazon, you know, if you're a small sort of a mom and pop store, or if you are an entrepreneur with a group of 5 people struggling to keep your business afloat in the beginning, well, you can't do this, and that's wrong. Essentially, the complexity, which is Google, the complexity, which is Amazon, started out very simply with focus on something very, very, very narrow and clear cut. And they were both started accidentally. Now, Google started as a university library indexing project. And once they had the algorithm, well, they thought, you know, we can use this. And the mission statement is very simple. It's to index the world's information and to make it available. That's it. That's all it is. Everything that they've done since is basically based on that. And it is that simplicity which has created the complexity, which is today Alphabet, which is a massive global organization doing like a zillion things. If we look at Amazon, Amazon started out to essentially disrupt the delivery model of something simple, books. So instead of going down to your local bookshop, they wanted you to buy books online, and books was essentially a fairly safe item to buy on the web at the time. So it made sense to start with that. And all they wanted to do was disrupt and optimize the supply chain, how the book got to us. So instead of all the many steps we had to take, you know, driving downtown, finding parking space, walking to the bookshop, trying to find the book we want, and see if they have it in stock. All those things, they basically optimized in the web. And that's led to the complexity that's Amazon. How we build the simplicity how we build this complexity from very simple things. There's a very even more recent example, which actually illustrates it beautifully. And I think anybody reading the news today will know that George Clooney became the recipient of $1 billion buyout from a tequila, which he has. There's a tequila company. The tequila company started entirely by accident. Now, the story behind this is beautiful, because essentially George Clooney did not set out to make money selling tequila. He didn't even set out to own a tequila company. What happened is he bought a house in Mexico with a buddy of his, so he had an adjoining property. And since they were in Mexico, they did what you do in Mexico. They drank tequila. and they ended up drinking a lot of tequila. They drank tequila in-house in their houses. They went out to bars. They went out to tequila tasting things, and they drank so many different tequila flavors and brands that they became kind of experts. And then jokingly they said to each other, well, why don't we make our own tequila? And all they had as a concept was wanted a tequila that was light enough to drink, that it didn't make you feel ill while you're drinking a lot of it. It didn't give you a bad hangover the next day. And it didn't give you a bitter, acidy aftertaste after you drank a little bit of it. That's it. So they wanted the most beautiful tequila taste in the world. Nothing too ambitious about that, right? Because it was just for them. They spent about 2 years talking to distillers and experts, and they set up their own tequila distilling process plant, which is very small scale, and they had tequila for themselves. And they happened to want to export 1,000 bottles of tequila to the UK for their own consumption. And at that point, they were told, look, you can't do this. You need to have a license. So then the third guy got involved in the process who knew the business, and he said to them, look, yeah, we can get a license. He got the whole thing licensed, and everything was above board, and they could import the stuff for their own consumption. And it kind of word spread and became a little bit more popular, and they ended up exporting to 20 countries. And that was then bought today or recently this week by I think it's Diageo, which is a British alcoholic company for $1 billion. So, you know, they didn't set out to build $1 billion tequila industry. They didn't do that. They had a passion for something very simple. They focused on the details because those details were very important to them. And the rest sort of thing happened. And although you think, okay, you know, this is a little bit of an outlier, they're actors, they had money to burn, etc. Well, yes and no. I mean, you know, they did not set out to build a business. The business was built because the product was great. And the product was great because they actually did what most distilling companies probably couldn't, and that was pay attention to detail in terms of how the product affected the customer. What sort of taste did it have? Did it give you a hangover? Did it make you feel good while you drank, I don't know, 20, 30 shots? Well, obviously to them it was really important. And, you know, every other distiller who didn't quite get to the same level obviously didn't pay attention to that. They paid attention to things like supply chain, and product distribution and branding and all the other things which, you know, MBA people tell you are important to pay attention to while you're building a business. But obviously we now know that, yes, they're important, but they're not as important as getting the simple things right and getting them absolutely spot on.
Yeah, they should have sold it to the Russians.
Yes.
Works better than what that sounds like. Okay, so with that, the only thing I wanted to add is that in my software development, you know, over the years and stuff, it's definitely been the case, and I think it's the case with most people, is that it's so much easier to just start with something really small and then build on top of it, step at a time. You know, if you watch one of the classic comedies like What About Bob, you know, they have the book in there called Baby Steps. I mean, you see it everywhere, evidence of it everywhere, that if you do something and then you incrementally improve it, you make huge changes. Like people tell you pretty much everything has already been invented. All you do is just come up with something that's maybe just 10% better, and you'll be massively successful because it's going to be like a complete revolution, just 10% improvement. And so in a lot of things, the things that we do, you know, just like if you look at how we cook things like that, you don't start out with some lavish, huge meal that immediately is built. I mean, you start with some set of ingredients and you combine them in some way and you do something with them, and then you kind of build up on it to finally come up with some elaborate meal. So pretty much everything we do, you know, cars are not just thrown together as one deal. You start with, you know, small little pieces of metal, and you start with bigger pieces of metal, and you start with some ball bearings and wheels and this. And I mean, now it's all of this is being combined into a car. So you start with smaller pieces, assembling to come up with something. You don't build huge things in Legos immediately. You start with a single piece of Lego, and then you wind up coming up with an incredible looking, you know, spaceship or something. So pretty much everything we do starts small and then being built up to a larger scale. You know, one last thing I'll mention, that one system I did that many, many years ago for a resort in Idaho. These days, when I look at this system and I look at how complex it is and how huge it is, I can't even believe I actually did it myself. I don't think I could do it myself looking at it now. And yet I did it myself because I started with something very small, and then I kept building it over the years, and it became the behemoth that it is today. So I think there's a lot to be said about looking at things with a focus and purpose, and then starting small and then building on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a brilliant example. Exactly.
At the same time, what I want to take us next to is the Darwinian approach that David talks about in the book in terms of natural selection, where obviously the things that are more capable and stronger wind up surviving, where the weaker wind up dying. And so what I wanted to ask David is a question: if he thinks that the Darwinian approach to selection, and in this case we're talking about the book about how snipers and people in, like SEALs and special forces guys, they go through this unbelievably rigorous selection process with, I don't think it's more than 20% that actually wind up remaining with the forces afterwards, right, David? Isn't it like
That's right, and a lot of the times it's even less. I mean, there are cases where they only had 12% of the recruits actually making it through.
So with that being the case, one thing I wanted to ask, which is kind of like a little philosophical question: do you think the current companies like Amazon and some other ones that do these 6-7 hour grueling interviews of people when they're trying to hire them, do you think it's meant to be for the purpose of this Darwinian selection, where they can weed out all the weak people, weak candidates out of there, or do you think they're doing it for some other reason?
Well, they are not necessarily trying to weed out, using Darwinian approach in terms of, endurance and who will actually make it through and who wants it the most badly. But I think their selection process shows something incredibly current and incredibly true, which is the difficulty of understanding the intention of someone in a short period of time. We are very complex in our interactions. We are hardwired to engage socially, and massive amounts of resources in our brains are devoted to actually connecting with people, projecting things, reading situations, and adapting on the fly. And that makes it incredibly difficult to actually understand the true nature of a person when it comes to an interview for a job. Now, if all you're looking for is to just fill a position, well, you look at the hard metrics. Do you know computers? Do you understand this program? Have you got some experience in the past? Are you willing to do it, etc.? And if you tick all the boxes, we hire you. And we know from experience now and from data that this process is incredibly lossy. We end up hiring people who don't want to be hired, really. They're unhappy. We are unhappy with the performance. Then the company tries to sort of force them to do things by offering bonuses or by putting in penalties, and the whole thing becomes pear-shaped very quickly. And I think in the 21st century, work, because we spend so much of our lives working, should be more meaningful. And one of the processes that companies like Amazon are trying to put in place is to create a sort of marathon, if you like, which will allow people to essentially project the true nature, or rather the true nature of people to emerge. And what happens in these sort of lengthy periods of time is that whatever shields that we have on, whatever filters, whatever false projections, because they require a lot more energy and effort to sustain, they quickly tire us out. And because they tire us out, they allow the more true nature of ourselves to emerge. If a company wants a team player, for instance, and you need a job, what are you going to say? I'm the best team player ever. But if you're not, it will actually emerge, because you can't fake this. Either you are or you're not, and that will become evident. So this is the real reason of the approach behind this. It does cost them an incredible amount of money to do this. So they're actually investing a lot in this process, and that's what we're seeing.
Right. But I do think there's part of it is also the deal about getting the weaker people out of the way, just like the SEALs do this incredible amount of training that they do, trying to get basically to see who is going to survive, who is going to be able to make the cut in the end.
I
and
think
that takes us to the next. Yeah.
I was going to say.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's not necessarily being weaker, but it is always being the right person for the job. And on the strength-weakness kind of view, let's keep in mind that when it comes to SEALs, the people they reject are usually, on paper, the people they should actually automatically let in. You know, they're strong, they're committed, they're dedicated, they are physically fit, they've done, you know, they've got all the necessary background experience, and yet they failed the test. And you got to ask yourself why. And the reason always comes down to that core set of beliefs that create your identity and then drive your motivation. You know, if you want it for the wrong reasons, if you're not ready for it mentally, if you're not ready for it psychologically, it becomes apparent very quickly, because it doesn't matter how strong you are, it doesn't matter how fit you are, it doesn't matter how skilled you are. What they put you through is more than one person can handle at any one time. So it's designed to break you. So what makes you not break? Well, these are the things which are, you know, critical to who you are and why you want to go through that. And it's the same with business. You know, if you look at any business in any setting, it becomes an incredibly hard thing. You know, the long hours, fatigue, challenges, unexpected problems, all these things are there, and like none of them are critically bad, but it's like the death of 1,000 cuts. If you're not sure why you're doing it, then all those little things become a massive obstacle you can't overcome. You make mistakes, you keep on making mistakes, you become disheartened, you make the wrong decisions, and before you know it, you're out of business. And you're going to say, oh, it was the economy, or it was the customers, they didn't understand what I was trying to do. Well, no, it's you. It is always you. It is always us. So we need to essentially always resolve and clarify the why of our existence. Why are we doing this instead of something else? Why are we doing it this way instead of some other way? If we can't really explain that, then we have cognitive dissonance, which creates issues.
So if you look at it from a standpoint, let's use the iPhone, since it's just been 10-year anniversary of iPhone, and there's a new book coming out about the creation of iPhone.
Yes.
And there's been some very negative articles about Steve Jobs. Nothing brand new. I mean, I've read books before about him and knew all along that the guy was one of the biggest jerks on the planet, basically, in terms of how he dealt with employees and stuff. But if you look at it if you put it in the same concept we're talking about now, where we're talking about putting people through something that usually people don't like to be put through, both physically, psychologically, especially in his case would be psychologically. I mean, the deal about people shoving him to the wall because they were sick of him, that's the physical aspect that wasn't happening too often. But it didn't even that happen. But I'm just saying, if you look at him being such a total jerk, I mean, there's no other way to put it, to a number of people on a continuous basis over the years, and then you look at the end result. So we're talking about SEALs, potential SEALs, snipers, people going to special forces who are being waterboarded, which is officially considered to be a torture, and they do it all the time with them to put them through this kind of training and everything. I mean, just brutal conditions, like you said, something that meant to break them. Then if we apply it to the business end of it, does it make sense for businesses to try to do the same thing? Essentially what Jobs did. I mean, you can kind of look at it as a similar deal to how he treated people, but on the surface, it looks like something you don't do as a nice civil human being. But at the same time, when you look at the end result and you see what kind of incredible people come out from SEALs training, and any of those special forces guys, and how the snipers come out, and then you look at the results that way, then you stop and pause. Was it worth all this agony and everything to come up with this? And based on results, the answer is pretty much yes. Right?
Okay,
I was
going to say.
But then you look.
Go on.
You look at the job situation, and you say, well, the guy was just a total jerk.
Yes.
But at the same time, look at the success of the iPhone. Look at what he pushed through, basically, even though the guy didn't invent anything in his life. But it's due to him that iPhone came out, and look how huge a success it's been. Apple being the most valuable company out there, money-wise, and everything. And it's mostly because of, for the most part, it's because of iPhone. If you kind of put all the little differences and things aside, it's the iPhone. And so you think, okay, so was it worth being such a person and treating people in such a way where people come out saying things like, I lost my marriage because of stupid iPhone, things like that. Should the businesses be adopting this approach or not? If you look at these two examples, for example.
Okay, all right, great. That's a really good question. And let's start with the military point of view. It is worth keeping in mind that every person who undergoes the extreme physical, mental, and psychological pressure that the military actually applies to people in order to make them Navy SEALs and elite snipers and scouts and scout snipers. Every person who goes through that, it's a voluntary process. They've signed up for that. They fully know what to expect. They fully understand what they're taking on, and they also know that they can fail. So, these are different things. Now, if you look at the business point of view, the expectations that people in business have is decidedly different. And because of that, I think the dissonance, when you bring up the Steve Jobs example, I think, we tend to see what he did through the lens of the success of the iPhone, and then we tend to justify it. But if the iPhone had failed, and, now Apple is no longer the most valuable company in the world, I think it's either Alphabet or Amazon, they're sort of stepping into that kind of position. But the real point here is we can't use the end to justify the means, because that is a very short-term thing. Any kind of business that has a lasting impact, that has a lasting journey through the world, is done on the basis of cooperation within the business and the voluntary approach to essentially creating a pressure cooker environment. But for that, they all need to be on board. And there are examples in Japan of businesses that are 1,000 years old. And if you think 1,000 years old, how is that even possible? The world has changed, the customer base has changed, the way we do business has changed, and yet the business still exists. Well, to me, that's a business that actually knows what it is there to do. And that's the big difference. So I think the Steve Jobs example is an outlier because of the outcome, which was visionary and disruptive. At the same time, it's an example of how not to do business.
Yeah, and those companies in Japan, they still have the same mid-management level people after 1,000 years.
Yes.
No, but well, seriously though, on the jobs thing, you can also see that. So I guess, yeah, the moral of the story is do not waterboard your people when you're hiring them.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
That's the thing. But at the same time, even with jobs, you can see that, yes, iPhone was wildly successful, and there were a lot of things that were done at this level, pushing people beyond basically what normally people should be pushed at, and the results speak for themselves. But it's not always been the case with him either, because he was the same guy, I'm sure, with people when he did Next, and that did not work out at all. That did fail.
Yes.
And so it's not, you can see that that's an example of same exact person. I mean, we're not comparing apples and oranges here. We're comparing apples to apples. How's that for an example? Huh? We're comparing apples.
That is actually pretty good.
And stuff.
It is good.
And you can see it's the same guy, same approach, I'm sure. It's not like he treated people differently. But yet he wasn't able to make it successful with Next. But he was able to make it successful with iPhone. So
yes,
it's just an interesting thing to look at. But with the stress situation, we're getting into the next part, which is in the book. It talks about something called stress inoculation training, or SIT for short. And this is what the snipers go through with this also grueling training. David, how does that apply, or does it apply at all to anything in business? Or maybe you just want to talk a little bit about the SIT thing, because it was pretty interesting in the book.
Yeah, it is. Well, it definitely applies to business people. Being in business is an incredibly stressful environment. There are so many things which are fluid, so many things which are unexpected. And in today's world, there are just more of those all the time. Now, essentially, with stress inoculation training in the Army, what you're doing is you're hardening people to be mentally tough. Now, everybody thinks that, the moment we talk about Marines and snipers and Navy SEALs, we're talking about some people who are incredibly physically fit. Yes, they are, but that's not the key here. This is not what makes them tough. What makes them tough is their ability in their heads to take pretty much any kind of difficulty and deal with it. And that takes tremendous amounts of effort, because you're operating at the very edge of your capabilities. So they're well outside their comfort zones. And yet, within that, while it takes tremendous resources, both physical and mental, to remain operational, they manage to do it and achieve positive outcomes, dealing with difficulties, dealing with problems, which to most people would appear insurmountable. And to sort of explain a little bit about this, I was talking on a podcast to a former Navy SEAL, and he told me, one of their routine missions is they're dropping out of a helicopter in the middle of the night in the ocean They have to then assemble their boat in the water, paddle to where they're going, and that's when the mission starts. And in all that time, whatever intelligence they may have had has possibly changed. The situation on the ground is completely fluid. And let's not forget, this is not a sort of a routine entertainment kind of flight they're taking. They're actually going in harm's way. So when you put all those things together, the question is, how do you go through with it? How do you not just give up? You think, oh, I'm tired now, right? I spent all this energy jumping out of the helicopter, paddling in the water, remaining afloat while I'm putting the boat together, and now I've got to paddle all the way to the shore. Oh, that's it. I've done it. Great workout. I'm going home. Well, you can't do that. So the mental toughness that's required is incredible. And there are verified techniques which are very granular in terms of the steps that they take, which allow these people to basically maintain their focus in these different difficult situations. In business, we don't have that. We go through MBA, that's plain sailing, right? We're at school. Controlled environment, everything is easy, centered around us. There's nothing fluid, nothing difficult. We go through, whatever, preparation we go through university, if you go through higher education or an apprenticeship, or even if you go and work for somebody. And again, things are pretty easy. Everybody's trying to help you do your job as easily as possible. So there's nothing adverse. And then, if you start out on your own, what are you going to face? One obstacle after another. And you're dealing with those obstacles and taking resources, so taking mental resources. And if you're not sleeping enough, physical resources. If you're getting stressed, more physical resources. So at some point, especially if you're a small team, so you're multitasking, you're wearing many hats, doing many different roles, you get to a problem and it's too much. That's where
the term going postal comes into play.
Yes. But you lose control. You feel you can't do it, and the moment you feel you can't do it, what happens? Well, you can't do it.
You can't do it.
So
right,
it doesn't
absolutely.
get done.
Yeah, as the famous saying goes, whether you can or you can't, you're right.
Yes, exactly.
You can't, you're right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So getting back into a little bit on the biological end, in the book you talk about the concept where people get into these really high stress, fear-induced situations where a process happens called vasoconstriction, where you're saying the blood flow is slowed and veins can hold twice the amount of blood. Is this only under extreme fear, or is that something they can actually induce to be able to, not suffer as greatly as regular people?
We can all be trained. We can all train ourselves without going to a military academy or putting ourselves through sniper school for 2 years. We can all learn these techniques to actually be better at controlling our physical responses. Every time we're under stress, our physiology changes. Our heart rate goes up, our blood vessels are constricted, our blood sugar levels change, the acidity in the blood changes. All those things happen to us. Most of the time, we're not even aware of these things happening because the situation controls us as opposed to us controlling the situation. Now, everybody feels stressed. That is a natural reaction. You cannot take that out of the picture. So what do you have to do then? You have to become better at managing stress. So as business people, if we're not aware of the physiological impact of stress on us, what happens is that gradually we degrade within a few hours, and by the end of the day our decision-making process is pretty poor. By the end of the week our decision-making process is appalling, and we're making really bad calls when we should be making really cool ones. So really, if we are aware of these physiological changes, then we can take steps to counter them. I mean, the basic things like taking a step back and breathing deeply for about 30 seconds. That in itself changes the physiology of the body. Taking a step back and just completely taking yourself out of whatever scene you're dealing with. I mean, snipers do it all the time. They're in a combat situation perhaps, and your eyes go blurry, you begin to lose focus physically because the mechanism of the eye begins to tire, your brain perhaps begins to tire, so your vision is impaired because of that, and your whole ability goes to pot. And then they're capable of that instant to just take 20 seconds where they look around, they look at the air, they sniff it, they take a deep breath, they touch the ground, and they focus on how they feel. That 20-second break mentally rejuvenates the brain. It resets everything. It's like rebooting. And then you go back into whatever you were doing. So, these tricks, which are not really tricks, they're actually tips of how the body works. We can apply them in everyday life. We don't have to be snipers, we don't have to be badass Navy SEALs. We can just be business people, and we sort of pride ourselves sometimes in getting through an email list and a to-do list with one thing after another, and we never take a break, we don't take lunch. We're getting more and more stressed, and we yell on the phone thinking it's the way we should be, and it actually works against us.
Totally. And speaking of ice, one example that's a little tip for people who use computers a lot, those that may not know it, in terms of ice, it definitely helps if you're going to spend a lot of time on the computer staring at the same screen. From time to time, look somewhere else, somewhere farther away, to focus your eyesight on something different. That's going to be very helpful for maintaining a healthier, I should say, vision if you do that, because otherwise your eyes will definitely deteriorate if you keep looking at the same. Basically, it doesn't have to be the same image, just the same distance. You're forcing your eyes to refocus when you look at something in a greater distance than the screen, or a closer distance than the screen, and that refocusing actually maintains exercises your eye muscles, and definitely makes a big impact if you do that. You don't have to do it a lot, just a little bit. Every 15 minutes, look somewhere else. Adjust your attention, focus on that, and then go back. All right, let's get back to the that's for real people. For regular people, let's talk about some irregular or amazing people. In the book, you talk about Chris Kyle, which is of course a famous
American
sniper, and it says example with him and the child in Afghanistan.
Yes. Well, this is I'll talk about this because, and thank you for bringing it up, because this goes to show that even though there's a lot of things which we can do when we simulate things with our minds, and we simulate things in a computer game environment or in a virtual reality environment. There's a lot of training which happens there, and our brain becomes very proficient and efficient at doing things. And this is the same when we train. We train for a job. We train in a safe environment. We do the parts of the job or aspects of it. We learn the routines, and then what happens is that the process called transfer, where those skills which we learned in that setting now are transferable to a real setting, where there are a lot more parameters, there's a lot more fluidity, we feel under a lot more stress, and yet, if we have been trained, we can do this. So when Chris Kyle was stationed in Afghanistan, his unit got PS4s, which is a PlayStation unit, and they used to play online, and he used to play one of the sniper games. And what happened was that despite him being one of the top US snipers and arguably one of the top snipers in the world, when it came to sniping within the game, there was this kid somewhere in the US that kept killing him consistently, and he got really aggravated and frustrated by this. And he told the kid, because he was wired up with a microphone, and jokingly, of course, he was a Navy SEAL, and when he got back home, he was going to hunt him down and kill him. And the kid obviously did not take him seriously, because he did not think this is a real Navy SEAL playing this game, and told him, you're in your mom's basement, which made it an extremely frustrating experience. Chris Kyle stopped playing that game because he kept getting killed. He just couldn't beat that kid.
Yeah. There is another example in the book, talking about stress, there's this Tommy Ann in the book who basically has this argument with his wife, and he got so stressed that he wound up hitting a wall a few times, and got his BP way up, and anyway, so then he had to basically take some breaths and everything, slow down, and to get back to normal. And I just wanted to ask David, wouldn't it be simpler to simply shoot the woman so he doesn't have to get all stressed out?
Well, I don't think that would do anything for his relationship. But again, this shows the sort of multiple ways we can basically use this on a practical basis. Whether we are talking about business, or we're talking about a more sort of conflict situation, or we're talking about how we build relationships. A lot of the things which I cover in the book have a very practical application. And he's a trained sniper. He got angry, as most of us can in a relationship, and he overreacted. Now, here's the thing: the moment we overreact, the part of the brain which causes the overreaction isn't subject to analytical processes. So essentially, our body goes into a cycle. We think, get feedback on that, feed into the loop, act and react. It leads to another reaction, and most of the times we are powerless to stop it, which is why we have, anything from road rage to people sometimes ending up in shooting arguments over nothing. Now, the beauty of this kind of mental training that I have written about is that essentially we learn to be aware of this. And the moment you do become aware, then you can take steps to diffuse the mental circuit in the brain, which is very old and very ancient and helped us in the past to survive, so that it doesn't go into this loop and it doesn't lock us down. So essentially, we take a step back, we look at what it is, we slow down and diffuse our own physical processes, we take our mental processes under control, and suddenly we can become more effective again. Whether this takes place in a business negotiation or even in a relationship between two people, I think these are techniques which are valuable because essentially they allow us to exercise self-control. And only this morning I was posting a little snippet that essentially if we haven't got self-control, if we have lost self-control, then we cannot ever hope to control a situation. Things are out of control then because we can't control ourselves. So that's it. So essentially self-control is key to being able to control a situation, which then becomes key to getting to the outcome that we expect to see.
Yeah, and you were not using the word self-control in the post. You wrote about discipline, and I think that's a really key point here. That obviously the Army is a perfect example of what discipline can be and should be. I mean, some schools are doing it to some degree, things like that.
Yeah.
One of the things that's highly missing in our public schools is proper amount of discipline for kids. But the way I look at it is, if you don't have discipline, you definitely immediately go into state of chaos. I mean, it's just, if discipline is not there, everybody does their own little deal. And then when you have chaos, you don't have any kind of structure, which means nothing is getting done the way it should be getting done. And that's basically it. So discipline and self-control is super important. We talked last time about, skating or skiing and then losing control, which is basically self-control. It's a different thing than getting enraged, but the same concept. If you lose control of anything, in this case you're losing control of your emotions, in this case you're losing control of your skis, the outcome is the same. You wipe out, you get into some sort of accident situation. Same thing with driving, all that. So discipline, self-control is definitely key. And if you look at the example with this Tommy N guy, it's very clear that he stepped back, he took a couple of breaths, calmed down, and then things were able to be resolved in a more appropriate manner. And I guess the other approach, when you go into the other direction, it's the old insanity plea, basically, when people get so where they just do things that normally they wouldn't do. And obviously everybody should try to avoid getting to that thing. But it does bring me to an interesting point, David.
Okay.
If you look at it from a standpoint, don't laugh too hard here. If you look at it from a standpoint of situation with Tommy N, the guy is a trained U.S. sniper. Is he a U.S. sniper or a British sniper?
He's a U.S. sniper.
Okay, so it's American sniper. Yeah. He's a trained guy. He knows how to deal with stress. He knows how to deal with these situations. He went through all this stuff.
Yep.
And so dealing with terrorists, he's able to keep complete self-control, right?
Yes.
But when dealing with his wife, he couldn't do it. Does it tell you something about wives or not?
Well, no, well, well, okay. I think that's a great question, and let me.
Okay, go ahead.
Sort of let me unpack it a little bit. We tend to think that people who are trained in a certain job and are really good at it should be great everywhere, and it's not always the case. I mean, and in his particular case, because I actually did talk to him at length about this, and he said, here's the thing: when he goes into action, he knows what to expect. He's got his game face on. Let's say he's mentally prepared. Nothing can faze him. He said ice goes through his veins because he doesn't get worked up about anything. It doesn't matter what will come across his path. He's going to be cool about it and deal with it. Now, step outside the situation. Your mental preparation is not there. You don't go and talk to your wife expecting things to escalate and blow up and get out of control.
I don't know if that's necessarily the case. That's not necessarily the case. Well, your wife.
Shouldn't be like that.
She is. No, no, but seriously, no, I'm not trying to be funny here. I'm trying to
Yeah.
be seriously. You do know a certain amount of information about who the person is. I mean, your wife,
Yes, yes,
and the environment where you're doing the
I know.
conversation, and what you're so it's because you can't say that he goes
I know.
into the sniper deal and he's
Yes,
completely and totally certain of everything. He's
yes,
definitely there's some
yes. But
uncertainties in
let's
place.
let's look at it in a combat situation. Perversely enough, things are more
Right.
structured. They're more structured. Why? Because you know you're going to get shot at. Things are going to be very fluid. You're going to have incredibly difficult moments and you have to deal with them. So for all this uncertainty, danger, unpredictability, there is a structure which mentally prepares you. And if anything has come from the book itself, it's that the mental preparation is what actually makes you behave in a certain way. Now, you know, when you come into contact with a friend or a colleague or your partner and there's a relationship there and things, you know, a trigger comes up, you know, whatever it is, and you get triggered. Well, most of the times it's unexpected. And the moment you get triggered, well, then your ability to analyze things and stop them immediately is very, very limited. So essentially, this is what happened here. And to his credit, he was able to recognize that, take a step back and regain control. A lot of people can't do that. You know, if you're not used to doing it, then usually what happens, you get into a massive argument with somebody, usually your wife, and you know, you end up sleeping on the couch for a week, maybe.
I'll still stick to my point, saying that in both cases you have some certainties, some uncertainties, and the deal with wife is so much more severe than any kind of sniper situation. Where
Maybe we should all go to Afghanistan instead.
this is where the term "war on women" came from, I think. Okay, let's not talk about that. Next thing you know, people are going to be throwing stones at me for this. All right, so moving on to the last part, because we're kind of coming up on time here. In the book, you're talking about kind of the process, if you will. I don't know what else to call it, but you have a situation where you're talking about training. You know, it's a process to go from A to Z. So you got training, then it turns into you having some kind of a feeling for the situation. Then that turns into you having knowledge of the situation, then turning into choice, where you can make choices based on everything I just described, eventually leading to action. So we got training, feeling, knowledge, choice, and then action. Could you please elaborate a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, this is the granular approach to how you control anything. Now, again, if we think about the example I gave earlier from a real life Navy SEAL who has to go into combat, jumping off a helicopter in the middle of the night, in the ocean, swimming, putting a boat together, paddling the shore, and then, you know, the unpredictability of his mission starts, and he still has to make it happen. You think, okay, how do you become like that? How do they do it? Are they special? Have they got different brains? Are their bodies wired differently? And the answer is no. But what they have done is they've been through this granular step-by-step process where they've learned gradually what they can do and how to do it. So essentially, you know, when you have a training, the training gives you the kind of emotional control over yourself and self-confidence and in your capability, which helps build your identity, which helps then build your perception, which then allows you to filter data in a different way. So instead of seeing impossible problems, you simply see problems that need to be solved. And then we go into all the other little steps where essentially you create the process which allows you to deal with that, finishing with action. Now, the action is the last one we take, but which makes all the difference. But in order for the right kind of action to happen, all the other layers have to be in place. You know, you need to have the training, you need to have the kind of identity, you need to have the confidence, you need to have the kind of emotional control, which allows you to deal with all these things. And again, I mean, a classic example of this is if I use the context of a trained boxer, for instance. And a trained boxer is a product of many years of gym work and sparring and boxing, and it's a physically grueling sport.
Watching
And
Rocky?
if you, yeah, exactly. And now, if you punch him in the chest as hard as you can, okay, chest is not going to stop him, it's not a knockout blow. You punch him in the chest, what happens? Nothing. He just keeps coming at you. Why? Because he's taken that blow, he's processed the information, he's assessed it and ignored it because it's nothing. Now, you do the same thing to someone who's untrained. What happens? They stop.
Mm-hmm.
Because their body goes into shock because it has a massive impact on their chest. There are pain signals going through their body. Their brain is trying to process it. They suddenly feel afraid for their safety. and they stop. Same thing to two different people. The only difference is, I mean, you can even take the same height, weight, and sex if you like. The difference is the training, and that training has essentially rewired their brains differently to deal with that, which is what makes the boxer now dangerous and the other person not.
And I think that all of this kind of, you kind of put your mind around it, the whole concept of focusing on something. I mean, reading that particular process in terms of these steps, I applied it in some of my own business stuff, and I had this brochure I made for my latest product, which is just my own creation. And then I looked at the brochure a little bit later after spending some time and showing it to people and thinking about it, and it's like, no, that's not how it should be written. It should be written a totally different way. And it's exactly the same product, but I spent some time, basically the training phase of it, and then looking at it again. You do get certain feeling what's right and what's wrong, and all of a sudden it's like, I wrote the thing, but I can see it's not the way it should be. So now you have this feeling, which is based on nothing more than training. Goes back into this deal when you get the feeling. And then, of course, after that, the knowledge part about if you spend enough time training and you get these feelings, you know what the stuff should be. So you apply the knowledge part. And then, of course, you have a choice. Do you make these changes or do you not make these changes? Now that you're so astute on the subject, you decide whether you want to make a changes or not. And that's the action part. Because if you don't take action, it doesn't matter if you think it's right or wrong. Nothing's going to happen. So I think this is, to me, it was a key point. Even though it's kind of common sense, at the same time, I think it was a key point for me reading through the book, saying, oh my God, this is completely applicable to just about everything you do in just about every aspect of business if you really think about it in this kind of manner. So I think it's brilliant, David, that particular deal, the way it's described.
Thank you so much.
And I think it's not only brilliant the way it's described, like I said, the common sense part is okay. Some people do it, some people don't. It's described, whatever. The important thing is if you start thinking about it in that particular fashion, that particular manner, it helps you move and become better at whatever it is that you're doing by applying these steps. And of course, the key being you start with something that you're training for and you end up with some sort of action, because a lot of businesses, I think, fail in many, many ways because they fail to take action. They may take lessons, they may do training, they may do all these seminars and books, and they don't do anything. And so I think the key thing is just the fact that you actually take action at the end, something that Tony Robbins preaches a lot as well, and it's brilliant the way it's described. Anyway, I'll wrap up by saying
same thing in society as well. When we have a disaster, for instance, or some sort of crisis, and they come out with a classic, lessons have been learned from this. Think when I hear this, what lessons? How? Right. And what did we learn? What are we doing differently because of that? So I think we have this knee-jerk response, lessons have been learned. We think we ticked a box, but really we haven't learned anything. The next disaster is eerily similar.
If you look, to me, the political thing is a perfect example of that. When we had 9/11, everybody were united. Everybody were together, we're united. Lasted for about 2 months. That was the end of it. Flags and everything. Yes. Then, if you look at the recent deal, if you look at the latest, the shooting, shooting at the baseball. Right. Okay. Same example. Democrats came out with this support. Everybody's together. After they were at each other's throats over all kinds of different issues, now all of a sudden they're together because the guy gets shot on the baseball field. And then I can guarantee you in another week or so, it's going to be right back at each other's throat. So I totally agree that this whole concept with people remembering, it's like you said, ticking a checkbox, meaning nothing. Unfortunately, we don't learn. Okay, let's wrap it up. One last thing I would say that you wrote in the book, that the sniper and business traits are basically patience, perseverance, attention to detail, and action. Those are the main traits that both snipers use, and I think business definitely can use as well. Let me repeat it again. Patience, perseverance, attention to detail, and action. With that, David, I wanted to let you just say a few last words. It's been awesome talking to you about the book. The book is great. I recommend everybody gets the book. Awesome book. But go ahead. Few last words.
I think I'll just finish with saying that we go through life being controlled by circumstances simply because we do not take the care that is required to be intentional in how we live our lives. And if anything came out of interviewing so many different military personnel who train to an extremely high level and carry out extremely high importance missions is their intentionality. They're very aware of the responsibility writing them, what they do, why they do it, and it is always clear in their minds. And I think this is exactly what we need in our everyday lives. If we do that, then things become a lot clearer and we become a lot happier.
Great, awesome. Okay, so again, let me put up a screen of from Amazon of David's new book. You can order both hardcover and the digital version. Both are available at significant discounts right now for pre-ordering. And let me jump to this Amazon deal here. And we're going to continue this conversation. We're not done with about half the book so far. So we're definitely going to have some more conversations, which will hopefully keep you going until the book actually comes out, so you can read it for yourself. Again, thank you everybody for coming. And David, thank you very much.
Oleg, thank you very much. I really appreciate this.
Take care.
You too.